My heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child and its mother. My soul is like the weaned child that is with me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time on and forever. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
And from Mark's Gospel today, picking up where we left off last week with verses 21 through 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" Jesus looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Pope Francis caught some flack a couple of weeks ago. You may have seen it on the news. On New Year's Eve, he was greeting a crowd, shaking hands with adults and blowing kisses to babies. As he turned away, one of the women on the rope line grabbed his hand and yanked him toward her so hard that he lost his balance. When he was stable on his feet, he swatted her hand away and then appeared to scold her before walking away with a scowl on his face. His people addressed the controversy by talking about germs and hygiene. Videos were posted all over social media showing him in other situations pulling his hand away from people who were trying to kiss his hand or his ring. All in all, the general consensus was that it wasn't a good look for a pope to appear in public like a cranky old man. He apologized the next day for his lack of patience. And while it didn't look great, frankly, on video, I did think it made him appear more human. Because everywhere the Pope goes, people reach out to touch him, devoted believers and others who long for the presence of holiness. His touch is understood to convey blessing, even if he's having a bad day, and he'd prefer that everybody leave him alone. And for as many hands as he clasps and babies he kisses, he receives countless more requests for prayers and healing and miracles. To believers, he is God's representative on earth and head of the church, and thereby, at least in their eyes, his job description includes restoring people to health. Well, as you can tell already, and we're only in chapter 5, healing is a big part of Jesus' job description in Mark's gospel. As the stories of his encounters with the sick are reported in markets and workplaces and synagogues, people reach out their hands to touch him everywhere he goes. And whether the person on the receiving end is suffering with leprosy or paralysis or demon possession, Jesus does more than simply fix their broken bodies. He uses the healings as opportunities to demonstrate that God seeks to restore people to wholeness, not simply physical fitness. Wholeness encompasses more than the physical. It's about spiritual, emotional, mental, and social health and well-being. And the healing of an individual, any individual, has ripple effects far beyond that person's life. It impacts family and community. So in healing individuals, Jesus extends healing to all those around them. And the stories in today's text clearly illustrate that. At first glance, Jairus and the woman in the story share little in common except desperation and the sense that if anybody can give them a miracle, it's got to be Jesus. Jairus is a healthy, wealthy, and powerful man. The leader of the local synagogue, he is one of the most highly esteemed and well-respected members of his community, accustomed to having others seek his counsel and beg favors from him. And yet no amount of privilege has prevented his 12-year-old daughter from falling gravely ill. Like most parents with a sick child, everything else diminishes in importance, and doing whatever it takes to save his child becomes his only concern. And also, like most parents with a very sick child, he feels completely powerless, which is reflected in his throwing himself at Jesus' feet, a remarkable act of submission for such a well-regarded man, and in his even asking for help. How strange it must have been for Jairus to beg when he's accustomed to being the one giving counsel, giving direction, giving favor. As the leader of the local synagogue, he was part of the religious establishment, which was increasingly resistant and hostile to Jesus' ministry and already plotting his demise. Jairus defies the growing tide of resentment among his peers to reach out to Jesus, a gesture not without serious personal consequence and risk. Before Jesus can help his daughter, though, he is interrupted by someone else in the crowd. And this other person reaching toward Jesus could not offer a more stark contrast to Jairus. She is an unnamed, insignificant, unconnected woman. She is also weak and sick and destitute, having spent all her resources seeking a cure for her debilitating medical condition. She, unlike Jairus, is not looking for special attention from Jesus. She would not dare ask him for a thing or even speak to him. She simply touches the hem of his garment with absolute faith that simply touching his clothing is sufficient to heal her. Just being in the crowd puts her at tremendous risk. The woman is alone out in public, unaccompanied by a male family member, which is scandalous in itself. That she is bleeding and in public takes her action to a whole new level of outrageous. According to Levitical law, a woman who was menstruating was considered unclean and therefore ritually impure during the time of blood loss. And whether that lasted 7 days, or in this woman's case, 12 years, she carries what one scholar calls the contagion of unholiness. She is supposed to remain far from others so as not to cause them to become unclean. So she is essentially banned from the market and the synagogue. And if she touches or is touched by someone else, that person also becomes unclean, limiting his or her mobility and behavior. And just as an aside, she can actually be stoned to death for putting other people at risk of impurity. Okay, so this poor woman has been bleeding for 12 years, which means she has been isolated for 12 years. No family gatherings, no family weddings, no worship, no embraces from friends, no physical touch from any other human being. And while she may not be facing immediate physical death, her condition is worsening, the text says, and she has been enduring a very real social death because of her condition and the laws governing it. Two desperate people with no other hope for healing but Jesus take the initiative to wade through a minefield of obstacles just to get to him. And in the end, both get what they seek. Jesus declares the woman healed. He does not shame her for being in public or admonish her for making him unclean. He listens to her story, calls her daughter, and then sends her home with a blessing of peace. Jairus' daughter is declared dead before Jesus gets to her. But when he says, "Little girl, get up," she does. He resurrects the child from the dead. These miracles are bigger than just ridding two bodies of disease. Jesus knows that healing is about wholeness. Genuine healing is never just limited to a condition or a body part. It involves all of one's being. For the woman to experience genuine healing at the hands of Jesus means not just an end to the world's longest period and the resolution or restoration of her physical health. Gone for her is the isolation of her impurity. Because of the healing that Jesus provides, she is restored to relationships and to a community. She can go back to the synagogue. She can go shop and have tea with her neighbors. And so it is with Jairus' daughter. Her miracle means that she is restored to literal life from literal death, but she's also restored to her parents and her family and a life in a community and a future she wouldn't have had otherwise. When my dad was diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer at the age of 59, I felt maybe more than I ever have before or since, like the world was crashing in. Every doctor we talked to, every article I read reinforced the reality that his physical condition was hopeless. And while chemotherapy and radiation might buy him some time and relieve the symptoms, maybe even put him into remission for a time, all of the experts were clear about the outcome. I would have done anything, would have taken him anywhere in search of another result, but he got to make his own decisions, and he opted for local doctors in the local hospital and the standard protocol. And since I couldn't really do anything else for him, I prayed. I prayed all the time, and I prayed for a miracle, that he would beat the odds, that he would be the one to survive what everyone said was unsurvivable. And initially, his tumor responded well to the treatment. He went into remission more quickly than they anticipated, and a remission that lasted longer than anyone said it would. And it was such a joyful and hopeful time, that miracle. But in the end, it played out pretty much like the doctors had said it would. And when the cancer returned, it came back with a vengeance. So I guess technically he didn't get the cure that we all prayed for. But oh, the healing was real, and it was substantive. The time that he got, the time that we all got with him, that was a gift. He got to go to weddings and experience births and vacations and family celebrations and retirement and a lot of golf. He reconciled with a sibling after many years of a difficult relationship. He had a lot of joy, and that was a miracle. So when I served as a hospital chaplain for 5 years, patients and families routinely asked me to pray for miracles, by which they mostly meant cures. And I never hesitated to pray, even knowing the diagnoses and the odds and the outcomes, because I knew God did miracles, because I trusted in God's capacity to heal whatever healing might look like in that given situation. And figuring that out was definitely above my pay grade. And while I never saw a physical resurrection in a hospital, I saw people walk who were told they never would, and be discharged home who hadn't expected to sleep again in their own beds or cuddle their pets. And I saw babies survive who weren't predicted to. I saw people live long enough to see their grandchildren graduate and their children marry and reconcile with family and make peace with God. And you know what? They might not have been cures, but they were miracles. There is so much good news in this story today. Like God heals. God restores people and families to wholeness. Our prayers and our hope and our faith on behalf of someone else are powerful and meaningful. Jesus is generous in his desire for healing for us. And unlike the way most of the rest of the world works, his attention and compassion are not limited to the rich and the powerful and the connected. More than half of the healings in the Gospels are of people who are marginalized, shut out of good society, like the demon-possessed Gentile in the cemetery full of pigs last week, and the unclean woman today. But maybe the greatest miracle of the story is the reality of Jesus' presence with us and for us. He clearly wants us to find healing from our afflictions, reconciliation in our relationships, and community in our isolation. Don't think I'm going too far on a limb to say that every single one of you in this sanctuary has prayed for a miracle at one time or another. Against all odds, despite what the doctor said or the Google searches revealed. We pray for loved ones, and we have prayed, even for ourselves, to be delivered from disease, pain, and despair. We prayed for an end to infertility, for a pregnancy to be sustained, that an addiction would cease, for a job before the money runs out, for direction when all other options are exhausted, for relationships to be restored, for peace in the midst of storms. As preacher and writer Barbara Brown Taylor reminds us, even Jesus prayed for a miracle on the night before he died. "Take this cup from me," he begged God, and the cup remained. But the miracle was that he drank the cup, Brown says, believing in the power of God more than he believed in his own power. It is always a miracle, she says, when we understand that God is God and we are not. So I say, in my completely professional opinion, pray for miracles. We need all the miracles we can get. They aren't in my job description to deliver, and they aren't in yours either. But we can receive them with gratitude, and we can tell others about them when we witness them. And we can trust that while they may not be cures, they are miracles that reveal a glimpse of God's kingdom that God really wants for us to see. Thanks be to God. Amen.